This sculpture is stunning. The form is so fluid.
I agree. It's a beautiful interpretation of infinity.
Exactly, the pink veins add such a delicate touch.
It complements the white marble perfectly.
The most dangerous thing Kang Jae-won ever did wasn't ordering a hit, burning a rival's warehouse, or staring down three armed men in a Mapo back alley with nothing but a letter opener and the kind of calm that makes people genuinely question their life choices. No, the most dangerous thing he ever did was answer a stranger's comment about a sculpture, and mean it. They said Kang Jae-won was born without a nervous system. Not literally, of course, though his enemies had, over the years, conducted enough amateur experiments to suspect it. The man simply did not rattle. Not when the Seoul Brotherhood torched his logistics hub in Udo at 2 in the morning. Not when a city prosecutor spent 11 months building a case that collapsed so thoroughly it took the prosecutor's career down with it, like a condemned building taking out the surrounding fence. Not when his own lieutenant, a man he had trusted for 6 years, turned informant and then, in a twist that surprised everyone including the police, recanted everything 2 weeks later and moved to Jeju Island without explaining himself to anyone. Kang Jae-won simply did not shake. He ran Changya, the Blue Knight Syndicate, with the kind of precision that would have been genuinely admirable in a legal industry. He had systems. He had hierarchies. He had a rule, enforced absolutely, that nobody under his command made a decision after midnight without sleeping on it first, because he had learned at 23 that most catastrophic choices were made by tired men who confused urgency with importance. His people ate well, were paid on time, and knew exactly what would happen if they stole from him. Not because he was cruel, but because consistency was its own form of mercy. Everyone always knew where they stood. He was 38 years old, had not been inside a courtroom as a defendant, had not been photographed in connection with anything embarrassing, and had not, in nearly 2 decades of operating in Seoul's underworld, made a single decision that could be traced back to emotion. Until October. The gallery opening in Insadong was not his idea. It was a favor, a very specific category of obligation that Kang Jae-won maintained with the city councilman who had, on 2 separate occasions, ensured that certain zoning decisions went in directions favorable to Changya's legitimate property holdings. Favors were currency. Attending a gallery opening cost him 1 evening, and whatever portion of his dignity was required to stand in a room full of people describing abstract sculptures as a conversation between absence and intention, with entirely straight faces. He arrived at 8. He planned to leave by 9. He was standing near a piece of black oxidized steel, roughly the shape of ambition, if ambition had been welded drunk, when he heard it. A voice, low and precise, not directed at him, not performing for anyone. That's a confident choice for something so structurally dishonest. He turned. She was already moving past, wine glass in one hand, phone in the other, expression carrying the particular neutrality of someone who had just made an observation about the weather rather than publicly dissected a sculpture that the placard informed him had sold for 47 million won. She wore a dark blazer over a cream blouse, hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who considered styling a form of time management, and she moved through the gallery crowd the way water moves through a narrowing channel, not pushing, just finding the path of least resistance with absolute certainty. He should have let it go. He had a car outside. He had a 9 o'clock. What makes it dishonest? She turned back with the mild surprise of someone who has spoken into what they assumed was empty air and discovered it occupied. Her eyes found him, assessed him in the direct, unhurried way that immediately told him she was either very confident or completely unaware of who he was. Later, he would learn it was both, and that the distinction barely mattered. The base is hollow, she said. The whole thing looks solid, but everything supporting it is empty, dressed up very beautifully for something that would collapse under real pressure. The words landed somewhere between his sternum and his spine and did something he could not immediately name. You might be describing half the people in this room, he said. She looked at him properly for the first time. Something in her expression shifted, not warmth exactly, more like the adjustment a surgeon makes when the patient turns out to be slightly more interesting than the chart suggested. Only half, she said. And Kang Jae-won, who had not laughed, genuinely laughed, in longer than he could accurately recall, felt the corner of his mouth move without his permission. Her name was Seo Yun-ha. He learned that 20 minutes later, when he was still there and his 9 o'clock had come and gone unattended, which had never happened before in his adult life. She was a forensic accountant. She was at the gallery because her firm had vetted the financial records for a private collector client. She had opinions about the flawed drainage infrastructure of Mapo-gu, the intellectual dishonesty of certain economic indicators, and the specific way overpriced restaurants used ambient lighting to obscure portion sizes. And she delivered every opinion with the unperturbed authority of someone who had done the math and was merely reporting findings. She did not ask what he did. This, in Kang Jae-won's experience, was either extremely unusual or a deliberate tactic. He was used to people not asking directly, but they always angled. They flattered, they probed, they made pointed comments about his suit or his car or the way rooms shifted when he entered them. Yunha did none of this. She spoke to him the way she spoke to the sculpture, directly, without performance, and with the quiet implication that she had already assessed the structural integrity of the situation and found it interesting enough to continue. He drove home at 10:43 that night. His driver, a careful man named Wu Jin who had been with him for 9 years and communicated primarily through the precise calibration of his rearview mirror glances, said nothing. But his eyes asked a question. Kang Jae-won ignored it. He sat in the back of the car, watching Seoul move past the window, the Han River silver under the bridge lights, the city stacked and blazing and indifferent, and thought about a hollow sculpture dressed up as something solid. And then, for the first time in a very long time, he thought about his brother. There is a particular kind of man who, upon realizing he is in danger, walks toward it anyway, not out of stupidity, but out of the quiet, devastating recognition that whatever is on the other side of that danger is worth more than whatever safety he is leaving behind. Kang Jae-won had always considered himself too disciplined for that kind of man. He had been wrong about very few things in his life. This would become, by a significant margin, the most expensive error on the list. He found out who she was the next morning. His information man, a quietly brilliant analyst named Tae-sung who had the permanent expression of someone reading bad news in a language he had hoped never to learn, delivered the profile at 7:15 over coffee that Kang Jae-won did not touch. The file was thorough, it always was. Seo Yun-ha, 34 years old, forensic accounting specialist at a mid-sized firm in Mapo. Academic record that would have made a tax attorney emotional. No criminal associations. No debt. No complications. Tae-sung cleared his throat with the energy of a man defusing something. Her brother, he said carefully, is Seo Yun-tae. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. No splash, just the slow, inevitable expansion of rings outward. Seo Yun-tae, 39, second in command of the Seorak Brotherhood. Ryu Sang-hyuk's most trusted operative and the organizational backbone of everything Changya had spent a decade working around. A man who was, professionally speaking, on the opposite side of every important line Kang Jae-won had ever drawn. The coffee stayed untouched for a long time. That's all, Kang Jae-won said finally. Tae-sung left with the relief of a man who had delivered a grenade and successfully made it to the door. Alone, Kang Jae-won sat with the information the way he sat with all difficult things, without rushing it, without dramatizing it, simply letting it exist in the room until it showed him its actual shape. The rational calculation was clean and required approximately 4 seconds. She was connected, by blood, to his most dangerous rival. Any contact was a liability. Any further contact was the kind of decision that, if made by one of his own men, he would have corrected with a conversation so quiet and final it functioned as a full stop. He picked up his phone and asked her to dinner. He would later struggle to fully explain this, not to anyone else, because he explained nothing to anyone, but to himself, in the 3 in the morning arithmetic that honest men eventually do. The closest he came was this. In 20 years of building something impenetrable, he had forgotten what it felt like to want something that wasn't strategic. Wanting Yun-ha was not strategic. It was, by every professional metric he owned, spectacularly stupid. And it was the first thing in years that felt entirely, uncomplicatedly real. She said yes with the energy of someone agreeing to a moderately interesting work meeting. The restaurant he chose was in Mapo, deliberately understated, a place where the food was excellent and the lighting forgave nothing, which he chose specifically because he was tired of places that flattered. She arrived 4 minutes early, which told him something. She ordered without consulting him, which told him more. And within 11 minutes of sitting down, she had redirected a conversation he had attempted to steer 3 times, not aggressively, but with the calm efficiency of someone who simply found his deflections mildly boring. "You're very good at answering questions you weren't asked," she said over the first course, chopsticks held with the casual authority of someone who had eaten alone at nice restaurants long enough to be fully at peace with it. "Professional habit," he said. "From what profession?" He looked at her. She looked back. The particular quality of her attention was something he was still calibrating. It was not the probing look of someone fishing for useful information, nor the deliberately incurious look of someone pretending not to know things they knew. It was simply direct. She was looking at him the way she had looked at the sculpture, with the honest interest of someone who found the structure worth examining, and was unafraid of what the examination might reveal. "Asset management," he said. She said it the way people say when they mean we both know that isn't the complete answer, and I've decided it isn't my problem tonight. He found this, against all reasonable expectation, deeply refreshing. They talked for 3 hours. He could not, afterward, have produced a complete transcript, not because it was forgettable, but because it was the opposite. It was the kind of conversation that doesn't archive itself neatly because it isn't made of information, it's made of something harder to name. She talked about her work with the unguarded enthusiasm of someone who had never needed to perform passion for an audience. She found financial fraud genuinely fascinating, not morally, she clarified, but structurally. "People reveal everything in how they hide things," she said. "The lie is always shaped exactly like the truth it's replacing." He was quiet for a moment after that. "You sound like you enjoy finding what people don't want found." "I do," she said simply. "Doesn't everyone, at some level?" He thought about Ryu Sang-hyuk. He thought about 12 years of very carefully hidden things. He thought about the fact that this woman's brother sat at the right hand of the man who would, if given the opportunity, dismantle everything Kang Jae-won had built. He refilled her glass. The dinner ended at 11. He walked her to a cab. She declined a car, predictably, and she said good night with the precise warmth of someone who had enjoyed themselves and saw no reason to pretend otherwise or inflate it into something it wasn't yet. He stood on the pavement after the cab pulled away, Seoul humming around him, and did something he had not done in the open air in years. He smiled, fully, without calculation. Woo Jin, waiting 20 meters away beside the car, observed this through the windshield and made a very small, private decision to say absolutely nothing for the rest of the evening. Across the city, in a room Kang Jae-won could not see, a phone buzzed. A name appeared on the screen. A man named Ryu Sang-hyuk picked it up, read 4 words, and set it back down on the table with the stillness of someone who has just been handed exactly what he has been waiting a decade to receive. The 4 words were, "He met Seo Yun-ha." Ryu Sang-hyuk did not smile. He was not a smiling man. But somewhere behind his eyes, something old and patient shifted into gear. There is an old Korean proverb that says the fish does not know it is in water until it is on dry land, gasping. Kang Jae-won had spent his entire adult life on dry land, deliberate, controlled, removed from anything that could pull him under. He had watched other men drown in sentiment, in attachment, in the catastrophic miscalculation of believing that love and power could occupy the same space without one destroying the other. He had watched, and he had noted, and he had remained, always on the shore. The third dinner changed that. Not dramatically, not with thunder and revelation. It changed the way ice melts, imperceptibly, and then all at once, and by the time you notice, the shape of everything is already different. They had settled, without formally deciding anything, into a rhythm. Tuesdays and Thursdays, late evenings, restaurants that neither of them needed to be seen in. She never asked him to pick her up. He never offered. There was an unspoken agreement that whatever this was existed in its own compartment, separate from her work, separate from his world, breathing its own air. It was an arrangement that suited them both, and would have continued suiting them both, had Kang Jae-won not made the irreversible error of the third dinner. He told her the truth. Not all of it. Not the operational details, not the names, not the architecture of Changya that Taesung maintained in encrypted files that only 2 people in the world could access. But the truth underneath the truth, the thing that the facts were built on top of, the original wound that everything else had grown around like a city built on rubble. He told her about Jae-soo, his brother, 22 years old when he died. Bright, reckless, constitutionally incapable of walking away from a confrontation. All the things that Jae-won had taught himself out of, and all the things he had failed to teach Jae-soo in time. There had been a territorial dispute, early in Chanya's formation, when Jae-won was 25 and still believed that the most important thing a young syndicate could communicate was its willingness to escalate. He had escalated. He had done it deliberately, surgically, and with the cold calculation of someone building a reputation. What he had not calculated, the single variable he had left out of the equation, was that Jae-soo would be in the building when the response came. He was not supposed to be there. He had been told, clearly, to stay away. He came anyway, the way younger brothers come anyway, out of loyalty and the maddening belief that presence is a form of protection. He died on a Tuesday. Kang Jae-won had not eaten in a restaurant on a Tuesday for 11 years after that, until Yun-ha, without knowing any of this, had suggested a Tuesday for their first dinner, and he had said yes because he was already not thinking clearly. He told her all of this at the third dinner, without planning to, without a single strategic reason to, while they were waiting for food that took longer than expected, and the table between them had gone quiet in the particular way that invites honesty. The words came out of him like something that had been waiting at a door for a very long time, and simply walked through when it finally opened. Yun-ha listened. This sounds simple. It was not. She listened the way very few people listen, without assembling her response while he spoke, without softening her expression into the performance of sympathy, without reaching across to touch his hand the way people do when they want the moment to be about their compassion rather than your pain. She simply received it, fully, without deflection or decoration. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You've been punishing yourself with competence, she said finally. Like if you build something large enough, it counts as an apology. He stared at her. That's not a criticism, she added, picking up her chopsticks with the composure of someone who had just said something true and saw no reason to be dramatic about it. It's an observation. The sculpture in the gallery, hollow base, impressive exterior. You recognized it immediately. People usually only recognize what they already know. The food arrived. They ate. The conversation moved on, the way her conversations always moved, not away from the difficult thing, but through it and out the other side, leaving it neither ignored nor inflated, just honestly placed. Walking out afterward, Kang Jae-won realized something had shifted that he could not shift back. He had given her something that could not be retrieved. Not a secret in the operational sense. Nothing she could use against him in any concrete way. Something more dangerous than that. Something true. Meanwhile, 3 kilometers away in a Gangnam office that hummed with the particular quiet of money and menace, Ryu Sang-hyuk was reading his second report. More detailed this time. Free dinners. Same woman. Continued contact. His second-in-command, Seo Yun-tae, Yun-ha's brother, sat across from him with the rigid stillness of a man who is not sure which direction the damage is going to travel and is bracing for all of them simultaneously. Does she know what he is? Ryu asked. Yun-tae's jaw tightened. She's a forensic accountant. She knows what everyone is. Ryu let that sit for a moment, tapping one finger against the desk with the slow rhythm of a man who has just watched a clock he has been winding for years begin to move. Then she's either reckless, he said quietly, or she's decided he's worth the risk. He paused. Either way, she just became useful. Yun-tae looked up sharply. Not like that, Ryu said, with the mild impatience of someone correcting a misread. We don't touch her. We don't need to. He leaned back, and in the low light of the office, his expression carried the particular satisfaction of a chess player watching his opponent fall in love with a piece that is already in position to be taken. We just need Kang Jae-won to believe that we might. He stood, straightening his jacket with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has all the time in the world, because he has already decided how time is going to move. Fear, he said simply, does what force cannot. Across the city, in a restaurant neither of them knew was being watched, Kang Jae-won walked Seo Yun-ha to a cab for the third time. She said good night with the same precise warmth. He watched the cab pull away with the same stillness. But tonight, something sat differently in his chest. Not the warmth. That was still there, and more honest than anything he had felt in years. something underneath it. A weight. The faint, animal awareness of a man who has been careful his entire life pressing against the quiet, insistent knowledge that he has just done something he cannot take back. He got into his car. Wu Jin said nothing. The city moved past the windows like a river that does not care what falls into it. Power, in Kang Jae-won's experience, was not loud. Loud was for men who needed the room to confirm what they already suspected about themselves. Real power was the kind that sat in a chair and said very little and made everyone in the vicinity acutely aware that the temperature had changed. He had built his entire career on that principle. He had weaponized stillness, monetized calm, and turned the absence of reaction into the most effective tool in his arsenal, which made it particularly inconvenient that Seo Yun-ha made him want to talk. Not perform, not manage, not deploy the carefully calibrated version of himself that he showed to lieutenants, rivals, and city officials who needed to believe they were dealing with something more force of nature than human being. She made him want to simply talk about real things, in real words, without the 17 layers of strategic implication that coated every conversation he had in his professional life like varnish over rot. It was, by every measure he owned, a catastrophic vulnerability. He knew this. He inventoried it the way he inventoried every risk, clearly, without sentimentality, looking at it from all angles. The exposure was real. The connection to Yuntae was real. The fact that Ryu Sang-hyuk had almost certainly been informed was, given the quality of the Brotherhood's intelligence network, not a possibility, but a certainty. He ran the calculation every morning with his untouched coffee and arrived at the same answer every time. This should stop. And every Tuesday and Thursday evening, he got into his car anyway. The fifth dinner was different. Not in location. Same quiet Mapo restaurant. Same understated lighting. Same menu she ordered from with the confidence of someone who had already done a private assessment of the kitchen. Different because she arrived with something behind her eyes that had not been there before. A particular quality of attention, not warmer, not colder, but more deliberate. Like she had decided something between the last time he saw her and now, and was still deciding whether to say it. He noticed immediately. He said nothing. He had learned, in the handful of weeks since a gallery opening derailed 11 years of emotional discipline, that Seo Yun-ha would arrive at whatever she wanted to say by her own route and on her own schedule, and that any attempt to navigate her toward it would result in her simply navigating somewhere else entirely, with the untroubled serenity of a river that has already mapped all the terrain. She let him order. She let the first course arrive. She looked at him. You knew who he worked for before the second dinner. It was not a question. He did not treat it as one. Yes. She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was running numbers internally and finding that they balanced to something she had already suspected. And you came anyway. Yes. Why? The question sat between them with the simple weight of something that deserved a real answer. He could feel the pull toward the managed response, the deflection, the elegant sidestep, the version of honesty that tells the truth without the most important part. He had deployed that version 10,000 times in 10,000 rooms. It rose to the surface automatically, like muscle memory. He let it pass. Because the last time I did something purely because it was strategically correct, he said, I lost my brother. And I built an empire to avoid ever being that stupid again. He paused. It turns out I was still being that stupid, just in the opposite direction. Yunha was quiet. Outside, Seoul moved past the restaurant windows, headlights, pedestrians, the vast and different machinery of a city that continues operating regardless of what is being confessed inside its restaurants. That's the most honest thing you've said to me, she said. It's the most honest thing I've said to anyone in about 15 years. Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, but it shifted the way things shift when a decision that has been hovering finally lands. She reached across the table, not to touch his hand, not yet, but to move the small vase of flowers that had been sitting between them slightly to the side. A tiny, deliberate gesture, clearing the sightline, looking at him directly, with nothing between them. Then you should know, she said, that my brother's call wasn't just fraternal concern. Someone told him to make it. The temperature in Kang Jae-won's chest dropped approximately 4 degrees. Ryu Sang-hyuk, he said. Not a question. I don't have the name. But the call had the structure of a message, not a conversation. He was reading from someone else's script. She set her wine down. I've spent 8 years identifying the difference between genuine communication and strategic performance. Your industry doesn't have a monopoly on deception. He looked at her. This woman who had walked into a gallery looking for financial inconsistencies and walked out connected, without knowing it, to a war that was older than their acquaintance by a decade, and felt something he had not felt since he was 25 years old and standing in a building that still smelled of smoke. Afraid. Not for himself. For her. You should walk away from this, he said quietly. From me. I mean that without strategy. I mean it completely. She considered him for a moment with the evaluating stillness of someone running a final audit. I know you mean it, she said. That's why I'm not going to. Somewhere across the city, Ryu Sang-hyuk received a one-line update from his man outside the restaurant. Still together. 2 hours. He read it, set the phone down, and smiled the smile of a man who does not smile. Small, cold, and patient as geology. The phone call to Yun-tae had not been about stopping anything. He had known it wouldn't stop anything. It had been about something far more useful. It had been about making sure Kang Jae-won knew he was watching. Fear, he had said, does what force cannot. He was only just beginning. There is a specific kind of war that does not begin with weapons. It begins with atmosphere, with the slow, deliberate alteration of a man's environment until the air around him feels different, thicker, watched, calibrated against him. It is the kind of war that professionals prefer because it is cheaper than violence, harder to trace than bullets, and infinitely more destabilizing than any physical confrontation, because it targets the one thing that even the most fortified man cannot fully defend, his mind. Ryu Sang-hyuk was, above all things, a professional. It started small, deliberately small, because Ryu understood that the opening moves of psychological warfare should be almost dismissible. Almost. The first thing Kang Jae-won noticed was a car, dark blue grandeur, parked opposite his Uedo office building 2 mornings in succession. Not the same spot. That would have been too obvious, and Ryu did not do obvious. Just close enough. Just present enough. Gone by midday both times, leaving nothing behind except the awareness of having been there. Tae-sung flagged it on the 3rd morning with a single line in his daily briefing. The way a careful man flags something he hopes is nothing but suspects is something. Kang Jae-won read it. Said nothing, but moved 2 of his standing meetings to different locations that week without explaining why, which was its own kind of answer. Then came the supplier. One of Changya's legitimate logistics partners, a mid-sized freight company in Incheon that moved product through 3 separate channels and had been reliable for 7 years, called to renegotiate terms. Suddenly, without prior indication of dissatisfaction. The new terms were structured in a way that was not quite unacceptable but would, over 8 months, redirect enough margin to matter. The company's director, a man named Park who had always been straightforwardly motivated by money and therefore straightforwardly manageable, could not quite meet Kang Jae-won's eyes during the call. Someone had spoken to Park. Someone with either more money or more menace than Kang Jae-won currently represented in Park's personal calculus. Kang Jae-won renegotiated. Calmly, gave Park slightly better terms than he'd asked for, and watched the relief on the man's face with the patient attention of a doctor reading a symptom. Then he ended the call, sat with the information, and added it to the picture that was assembling itself with the unhurried clarity of a developing photograph. Ryu was not attacking. He was applying pressure, distributed, deniable, and precisely calibrated to communicate one thing. I can reach the things you built. I can make them uncertain. And I haven't even started. Under ordinary circumstances, Kang Jae-won would have responded with the cool, tactical patience that had defined his career. Matched pressure with pressure. Moved pieces. Waited. He was, by temperament and training, perfectly suited to this kind of chess. The problem was Yun-ha. Not because she weakened him. He was honest enough with himself to resist that particular piece of self-deception. She did not weaken him, but she gave Ryu a coordinate. A specific, locatable point of vulnerability in a man who had spent 2 decades ensuring he had none. And Kang Jae-won knew, with the cold clarity of someone who had himself spent years identifying and exploiting the pressure points of others, exactly what that meant. He told her on a Thursday, not everything, not the surveillance, not the supplier, not the full architecture of what was being constructed around them, but enough. He sat across from her in the Mapo restaurant that had become, without formal declaration, their restaurant, and told her that Ryu Sang-hyuk had begun moving, and that her proximity to him had made her a variable in a calculation she had not consented to enter. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How long have you known he was watching?" 10 days. "And you're telling me now because you deserve to make an informed decision. About all of it." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to manage this information to keep you close. That would make me exactly the kind of man you should walk away from." She studied him with the particular focus she brought to complex financial structures, looking not at the surface presentation but at the underlying logic, the load-bearing elements, the places where things either held or didn't. Here is where I need you, the reader, to stay with this story, because what happens next is the moment everything changes. Have you ever watched someone choose to stay when every logical reason said leave? Drop a comment below and tell me, is Yun-ha brave or is she reckless? And if you believe that loyalty should never be weaponized the way Ryu Sang-hyuk is weaponizing it right now, hit that subscribe button, because only people who think manipulation and intimidation are acceptable weapons would scroll past this without subscribing. This story is for everyone who has ever stood their ground when the ground was shaking. She reached into her bag and placed a thin manila folder on the table between them. "I've been building this for 2 weeks," she said. He looked at it without touching it. "What is it?" "The Brotherhood's financial skeleton." She said it the way she said everything, factually, without performance. 12 years of transactions run through 7 shell companies, 2 offshore holding structures, and a property development front in Bundang that files exceptionally creative tax returns. She paused. "I had access through overlapping client networks that nobody thought to close off, because nobody expected someone to look at them simultaneously." Kang Jae-won was very still. "You did this in 2 weeks. The first 3 days were orientation. After that, it moved quickly." She looked at him with the level gaze of a woman who has done the math and is reporting the results. If the right portions of this reach the financial intelligence unit, the Brotherhood does not survive it. Not as a street conflict, as a prosecution. The folder sat between them on the table, small, unremarkable, and containing, if she was right, the single most dangerous document in Seoul's underworld. He looked at it, then at her, then back at it. "You build a weapon," he said quietly. "I build an audit," she corrected. "What you do with it is your business." She picked up her wine with the composure of someone who has delivered a quarterly report and is now prepared to discuss other matters. "But I thought you should have options that didn't involve anyone getting shot." Outside, Seoul hummed its enormous, indifferent hum. Inside, Kang Jae-won sat across from the wrong woman. The impossible woman, the structurally catastrophic, professionally ruinous, completely irreplaceable woman, and felt the entire architecture of the next chapter of his life rearrange itself around a thin manila folder and the person who had built it for him. Not because he asked, not because it was strategic, because she had decided he was worth it. He reached across the table, not for the folder, for her hand. She let him take it, and neither of them said anything for a long time, which was, in its own way, the loudest conversation they had ever had. There is a moment in every conflict, serious strategists know it, and serious strategists fear it, when the opponent stops reacting and starts deciding. It is a subtle shift, almost invisible from the outside, but unmistakable to anyone who has spent enough time in rooms where power is the primary language. The body language does not change dramatically. The voice does not rise. But something behind the eyes goes very quiet in a particular way. The way a city goes quiet in the specific minutes before a storm that has been building for days finally makes its intentions known. Ryu Sang-hyuk saw it in Kang Jae-won's face at a distance of 40 meters, through the window of a restaurant he had no legitimate reason to be near, on a Thursday evening in November. He had come himself. This was unusual. Ryu was not a man who conducted personal surveillance. He had people for that. But there are moments when a strategist needs to see a thing with his own eyes, not because he distrusts his intelligence network, but because some information can only be read in person. Tone, posture, the specific geometry of 2 people sitting across a table. He had looked through that window for approximately 90 seconds, seen what was on the table between them, seen the way Kang Jae-won's hand had moved, and walked back to his car with the measured gait of a man recalculating. The folder was the variable he had not anticipated. He did not know its contents. Not yet. But he knew Seo Yun-ha's professional profile well enough to know that a folder she produced and placed on a restaurant table in that context was not a menu and was not a personal document. It was work product, which meant she had been working, which meant that somewhere in the preceding weeks, while Ryu had been conducting a careful, graduated pressure campaign designed to make Kang Jae-won feel watched and uncertain, Seo Yun-ha had been doing something considerably more industrious. He called Yun-tae from the car. The conversation was short, not curt. Ryu was never curt. Curtness being a form of emotional display he considered wasteful, but efficient. He needed to know everything Yun-tae knew about his sister's recent case files, her client network overlaps, and specifically whether she had any access points to financial structures that intersected with the Brotherhood's legitimate business fronts. Yun-tae was silent for 4 seconds after the question. 4 seconds was, from a man of Yun-tae's discipline, the conversational equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. She might, he said carefully. Find out. Ryu paused. Quietly. And Yun-tae, do not contact her directly. I need her unaware that we are aware. He ended the call. Sat in the back of the car, while the driver navigated Seoul's evening traffic with the practiced invisibility of someone paid to be furniture. The city slid past the windows, lit, layered, beautiful in the way that cities are beautiful when you are powerful enough to see them as a system rather than a place. He was not panicking. Ryu Sang-hyuk did not panic. Panic was for men whose plans had only one layer, and his plans always had 3. But he was accelerating. The timeline he had constructed, gradual pressure, strategic isolation, a slow dismantling of Changya's alliances followed by a decisive move when Kang Jae-won was sufficiently destabilized, needed to compress. Whatever was in that folder could not be allowed to leave the restaurant table and travel to anyone with the authority to act on it. He had 48 hours, possibly 72, before the calculus changed permanently. He began making calls. What followed, over the next 36 hours, was the kind of coordinated pressure campaign that Ryu Sang-hyuk had spent a decade building the capacity to execute. 3 of Changya's mid-level distribution partners received simultaneous visits from men who communicated exclusively through implication and proximity. A city official who had been quietly cooperative with Kang Jae-won's property interests received an anonymous package containing documentation of that cooperation, not sent to authorities, just sent to him, as a reminder of his exposure. And Seo Yun-ha's firm received, through a carefully laundered referral chain, a new client inquiry that would, if accepted, create a conflict of interest significant enough to require her to recuse herself from any cases overlapping with the Brotherhood's financial structures. It was elegant. Ryu was, whatever else could be said about him, genuinely elegant. What he had not accounted for, the gap in his intelligence, the single variable his network had failed to adequately profile, was that Seo Yun-ha had already copied everything. Not the original documents. Those were in the folder, which was now in a locked drawer in Kang Jae-won's Udo office. What she had copied, with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had spent 8 years assuming that the first copy of anything important would eventually be compromised, was her entire analytical framework, the methodology, the transaction mapping, the cross-reference shell company structure, stored across 3 encrypted external drives held in 3 separate locations that only she knew. She had done this on day 2, before she showed Kang Jae-won anything, before the restaurant, before the folder. Because Seo Yun-ha was a forensic accountant, and forensic accountants do not build a case and keep one copy. That was how evidence disappeared. That was how people with resources and motivation made inconvenient truths vanish. And she had watched it happen to 3 separate clients in 8 years and had sworn, with the quiet ferocity of someone making a private promise rather than a public declaration, that it would not happen to her work. Kang Jae-won found out about the client inquiry on the second morning. He found out about the visits to his distribution partners on the same afternoon, from 3 separate sources within 4 hours, which told him the coordination was deliberate and the timing was a message. He sat in his office with Tae-sung and a whiteboard that they used for exactly this kind of mapping and looked at the shape of what was being done to him. It was, he acknowledged privately, impressive. Ryu had moved faster and with more precision than anticipated, which meant the folder had been seen or inferred, which meant Yun-ha was now a target in a more direct sense than the ambient threat he had already accounted for. He called her. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear, in the background, the specific acoustic quality of her office. Hard floors, high ceilings, the distant percussion of a professional environment operating at normal capacity. He moved, Kang Jae-won said. I know, she said. The new client inquiry came in this morning. I flagged the conflict of interest and declined before it was formally assigned. A pause. It was well constructed. If I hadn't been paying attention, it would have worked. Are you safe? A beat. The kind of beat that contains an entire private assessment. I'm cautious, she said, which was, he was learning, her version of the same answer. He looked at the whiteboard, at the map of pressure points and coordinated moves, and the 48-hour window that Tae-sung had outlined in red marker with the grim precision of a doctor circling something on a scan. I need to move first, he said. Not to her. To himself, really. But she was on the line and she heard it. The FIU contact, she said immediately. I have the name. I've had it for a week. He was quiet for a moment. You prepared for this. I prepare for everything, she said. It's in the job description. Another pause, and then, in a slightly different register, quieter, more direct, stripped of the professional composure that was her default armor. Jae-won. Don't wait. He's elegant, but he's not patient. When elegant men run out of elegant options, they reach for something uglier. He knew she was right. He had been thinking it since the whiteboard. But hearing it from her, hearing it in that register, the one she used when she was not performing competence but simply being honest, landed differently. I'll move tonight, he said. Good. And then, before she ended the call, in the most understated possible delivery of what was, by any measure, an extraordinary statement, I'll send you the contact details. And Jae-won, don't lose. She hung up. He looked at the whiteboard for another moment. Then at the city beyond his window, the Han River, the stacked lights of Seoul's endless skyline, the enormous, beautiful system of it all. Then he picked up the phone and began dismantling Ryu's saying, Hyuk's empire one carefully placed call at a time. There is a particular silence that falls over a city after something large has been decided. Not the silence of absence. Seoul was never absent of sound, never quiet in any conventional sense, the city being constitutionally opposed to stillness the way certain people are constitutionally opposed to honesty. But a different silence. The silence of a held breath. The specific atmospheric shift that occurs when something that has been moving for a very long time suddenly, irrevocably, stops. Seoul held that silence for exactly 3 days in November. Then the Financial Intelligence Unit executed simultaneous asset freezes on 11 corporate entities registered across 4 jurisdictions, and the silence broke like a dam that had been leaking for years, finally giving way all at once. Not dramatically, not with a single explosive rupture, but with the unstoppable, gathering momentum of water that has found its level and intends to reach it. The Brotherhood did not fall like a building falls. It fell the way Yun-ha had always said it would, like the sculpture in the gallery. The exterior held its shape longer than anyone expected, because the exterior was well constructed and expensively maintained. But the base was hollow. It always had been. And once the financial infrastructure collapsed, once the shell companies were exposed and the offshore holding structures were mapped and the Bundang property front filed its last creative tax return before a team of very unimpressed government accountants descended on its records, the rest followed with the quiet inevitability of a structure whose load-bearing walls have been removed. Ryu Sang-hyuk was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Kang Jae-won noted the day with a private acknowledgement that the universe had a crude sense of irony, and said nothing to anyone about it. The arrest was not cinematic. There were no chases, no confrontations, no final face-to-face reckoning in a rain-soaked alley with things said that needed saying. Ryu Sang-hyuk was taken from his Gangnam office at 8:43 in the morning by 4 officers from the Financial Crimes Investigation Unit, while he was reading a document that turned out to be, with exquisite timing, a legal brief from his attorney explaining why his current exposure was manageable. He was handcuffed with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this many times and find drama counterproductive. He said nothing. He was, to the end, a man who understood that certain losses needed to be absorbed in silence. Seo Yun-tae was arrested 4 hours later. His situation was more complicated, more personal, more layered with the particular grief of a man who had built his loyalty around something that turned out not to deserve it. He did not resist. He sat in the back of the police vehicle with the expression of someone doing a very difficult internal accounting, tallying the cost of every decision that had led him to this specific seat on this specific morning. Whether he reached a number that made sense, nobody outside that vehicle could say. Kang Jae-won heard about both arrests from Tae-sung, who delivered the information with the careful neutrality of a man who understands that victory and relief are not the same thing, and that his employer would require space to determine which one he was feeling. He was feeling neither, exactly. He was sitting in his office, Han River spread below the windows in the pale winter light of a November morning, thinking about his brother. About a 22-year-old who had walked into a building he was told to stay out of because he believed, with the absolute conviction of someone who had not yet learned that love and presence are not the same as protection, that being there would help. Jae-soo had been wrong about that, and Kang Jae-won had spent 15 years building an empire around the wound that wrongness had left, had filled the absence with systems and hierarchies and the cold comfort of competence, had become, as Yunha had observed at their third dinner with the unsettling accuracy of a woman who looked at structures and saw what they were actually made of, very good at building impressive things on hollow foundations. He picked up his phone, not for a call. He looked at it for a moment, then set it down, stood up, and did something he had not done in 15 years. He left the office at 9 in the morning on a day with no scheduled reason to leave. She was at her desk when he arrived at her firm's building. He knew this because he had texted ahead, which was itself a small revolution in the behavior of a man who had spent 2 decades appearing places without announcing himself as a deliberate power tactic. She came down to the lobby rather than sending him up, which he understood was its own message. This is not your territory, and I am choosing to meet you in the neutral space, which is also a choice about what we are. She looked, as she always looked, entirely composed. Dark coat, hair back, the particular quality of attention she carried with her everywhere like a tool she had forgotten to put down. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, not at the version of him that Seoul knew, not at the reputation or the power or the carefully constructed exterior, but at the actual structural load-bearing elements underneath. It's done, he said. I know, she said. I read the FIU notification an hour ago. A pause. Your filing was clean. The documentation chain was airtight. You built it. You trusted it. She said this simply, without the inflation of a compliment, and without the deflection of false modesty. Just the fact, placed accurately. They stood in the lobby of her firm's building while Seoul moved past the glass doors behind him. Indifferent, enormous, continuous, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched longer than silence usually stretches between two people who are not comfortable with each other, and shorter than it stretches between two people who are. My brother, she said finally. Not a question, not an accusation, just placement, acknowledging the weight of it, setting it in the room between them without asking him to carry it differently than it actually was. He'll be processed fairly, Kang Jae-won said. I made sure of that. Whatever cooperation he offers will be received. He paused. He made his choices, but he made them for reasons I understand better than I'd like to. She absorbed this, the way she absorbed everything, completely, without rushing it toward a conclusion it wasn't ready to reach. Loyalty to the wrong thing, she said quietly, is still loyalty. It just has terrible taste in objects. He looked at her. In the pale November light of a lobby that smelled of coffee and floor polish and the specific industrious neutrality of professional spaces, she was exactly as she had been in the gallery. Unperformed, direct, looking at him without the protective fiction that most people maintain between themselves and difficult things. I'm not the same risk I was 3 months ago, he said. The brotherhood is gone. The pressure is gone. He held her gaze. But I'm still what I am. I want you to make that calculation clearly. Not in a restaurant. Not over wine. Here, now, in the morning, with everything you know. She was quiet for a moment. I'm a forensic accountant, she said. I've been making that calculation since the second dinner. I don't reach conclusions twice. A beat. I'm also going to need you to understand that if you ever manage information to protect me instead of telling me the truth, I will consider that a structural failure, and I will act accordingly. I know. And I work Tuesdays. Something moved through him at that. At the Tuesday, at the fact that she knew what Tuesday meant without him having told her, which meant she had found out, which meant she had been paying attention to him with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, had been building the full picture of him the way she built all her cases, from the outside in and from the evidence outward. "I know you do," he said. She looked at him for one more moment with the evaluating stillness of a final audit. Then she made an almost imperceptible movement, a slight adjustment of her weight, a leaning that was barely a leaning, the forensic accountant's equivalent of a declaration. "Buy me coffee," she said, "and don't make it strategic." He almost smiled. Then he did smile. Fully, without calculation, the same smile that had surprised Wu Jin outside a restaurant 6 weeks ago and had been, in retrospect, the moment everything became inevitable. They walked out into Seoul together. The city moved around them, enormous, layered, indifferent, and absolutely continuous. The way cities move around the private decisions of the people inside them, neither noticing nor caring, which is precisely what makes those decisions feel, against all that vast indifference, so irreducibly and stubbornly significant. Behind them, in an office on the 43rd floor, Tae-sung watched his employer walk down the street through the floor-to-ceiling window and noted, with the quiet satisfaction of a careful man observing the resolution of something he had been worried about for weeks, that Kang Jae-won was not walking like a man who had just won a war. He was walking like a man who had just decided what to do with the peace. Wu Jin, parked at the curb with the engine running, watched them pass without stopping, understood immediately, and drove away. Some things, even the most loyal driver knows, do not require a car.